There's been pressure on oil and gas companies for a long time now to divest of carbon intensive assets like oil wells, for instance, and they've been doing that. But the problem is, where do those assets go? Are they shut down? No, no, they get transferred to other companies that may not be as environmentally responsible as the companies that sold them. And the Environmental Defense Fund has now written a report about this, and I'm going to talk to Gabriel Malek, who's their project manager, investor influence out of New York. So welcome to the interview, Gabriel.
Thank you for having me. Great
Now,
to be
this is
here.
well, thank you for being here. This is a big problem. In Canada, for example, we've been grappling with this for a while. And some of these wells that are being transferred, these assets, wind up as being what are called orphan wells, and they're often leaky, and they get thrown back on the industry or even the government to get them cleaned up. So that's kind of as context. But maybe let's start with an overview of the study, please.
Absolutely. So this problem of transferred emissions is one that stakeholders across the energy space have been talking about for a little over a year and probably longer in some circles. But through our background review of conversations on transferred emissions, we hadn't seen any detailed analytical research on this problem. There were some concerns that oil and gas companies that were beginning to embark on the energy transition were selling assets to either private operators or even worse, private operators with poor climate commitments, but there were no numbers on that. And we felt like that was a real gap. So we had two goals in this research. The first was understand where oil and gas assets are moving, and two, understand the climate impact of that movement. And we looked at the last 5 years of upstream oil and gas M&A globally with that intention, answering those two questions. We found three things. First, that oil and gas assets are moving overwhelmingly from public to private markets. Second, that oil and gas assets are moving overwhelmingly from companies with climate commitments to those without. And then third, that these transfers are already having real world climate implications. And we answer that question by looking at some specific transactions that are listed as case studies in the report, where we show that after an asset was transferred from a company with strong climate commitments to one without, flaring of gas increased almost 4 times from its original average. And in another case study, to your point on orphaned wells, we show that after a similar transfer took place in the Permian Basin in Texas, although originally wells were being retired at a rate of about a strong rate that could end in about 9 years, with the new operator, it will take about 120 years to decommission those wells. So it's having real impact, and that's what we wanted to demonstrate with this research.
Right. And I think this is one of the points that industry critics have made for a while, is that divestment doesn't always solve the problem that you set out to solve by putting pressure on these, more environmentally responsible producers. So I understand now that if I'm understanding your data correctly, about 15% of all the M&A transactions involve these kind of problems.
That's right. About 15 as of 2021% of annual transactions are what we call reduced environmental commitments. So going from an operator with targets on methane flaring net zero to an operator that lacks such targets. It's important to note, I'll just mention that 15%, it doesn't seem like that large of a number. And we could be lulled into thinking that the rest of the industry is doing well. The vast majority of transactions are still taking place between companies that both lack climate commitments. So there's a lot of work to be done to improve industry performance on climate broadly. But now you have this transferred emissions problem where progress we think we're making is actually being reversed.
Right. Now, I know in Canada, for instance, oil and gas production, methane emissions are a big focus of government regulation. So the federal government has said that they want to decrease them by 75% by 2030. So that's a major reduction. Not so much in the US. In fact, the industry has been fighting the government there. There are methane emissions and regulations in Europe. So is the recommended policy approach here is okay, if the methane emissions are the problem, let's just focus on that and we'll catch the bad actors who were picking up these assets from the more responsible actors?
I think it's three things. Methane is crucial, and right now the Environmental Protection Agency in the US is considering proposed rules on heightening methane regulation for the oil and gas sector. I think you can nail one level deeper and focus on flaring, which is a key source of methane emissions. And there you have guidance from the EPA. You also have state regulations that are particularly important in states like Texas, where there's significant oil and gas activity. And there we look to the Texas Railroad Commission to institute standards for zero routine flaring. And then third is the point that I alluded to earlier on decommissioning of assets. So we don't have this orphan well problem. And certain states in the US, like Arkansas and Colorado, soon to be, have bonding requirements that essentially force operators to set aside the amount of money required for decommissioning at the point of operations, so that by the time the well declines, we know that there's still money set aside to take that offline and not pass that burden on to taxpayers. So I think it's those three things. And the impulse can sometimes be, oh, transport emissions, that has to do with M&A. Do we need to regulate M&A transactions themselves? I don't think that's the answer. I think we need to raise the floor on what it means to be an oil and gas operator in 2022. And that comes from the standards I outlined.
Right. Now, again, getting back to Canada, there's a two-pronged approach here. The federal government has legislation that it can, it can use to reduce emissions from specific industries like oil and gas. And it is in the process of creating a policy framework for a hard oil and gas emissions cap. Very controversial in the industry right now. But it's also managed to get the provincial governments where the industry is working, like Alberta and BC, to agree to their methane emissions reductions targets. So you've got that, and that's where most of the regulation usually occurs, is at the provincial level, and it's fairly similar to the US. So my question is, how much leverage does the EPA actually have here to get the Texas Railroad Commission and Oklahoma, North Dakota, because those states have had pretty industry-friendly regulators historically, and are the regulators going to work with the federal government or oppose it, as they have done in other things like Obama's Clean Power Plan?
It's the right question, especially with broader divides between states and federal government on climate in the US. I think that we need to take a parallel track. So EPA methane regulation is essential to getting the industry on a path towards a net zero economy. And we actually have seen a number of companies in industry support steps from the EPA on that front, because they want a level playing field. They don't want some of their competitors to be able to continue to get by on poor environmental standards while they take the time and spend the money to get flaring and methane right at their operations. So I think industry is coming around to EPA action in a number of fronts, and the state question still remains. Even when you have good EPA measures, you can have another layer of accountability with strong state regulation. And so I don't think it's an either or, but I think EPA can take up some of the oxygen, and that's when you lack some of that industry support at the state level, because we're all rallying around the EPA regs. So to the extent we can, I think it's important to try to involve industry in both of those camps, because they're both ultimately essential.
Well, Gabriel, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you. It's great to speak.